So, just because I love the software development, but always my frustration has been around communication. I find it frustrating when, as a developer, I know that the BAs or the person who is collecting data knows all about what the client told them. But all they gave me was a report. They didn't give me the data, so I can't put it into my tests. And I'm sure you can think of examples in all the different areas for that. So, while a general solution is never going to be possible, I've been working on an open source package to at least start putting that together. And for want of a better name, it's uSDLC for Unifying the Software Development Lifecycle. I keep trying to think of a fancy name, can't come up with one. That's it sitting there now, and I'm actually using it. So this is the screen we'll be using for effectively the slideshow. Running from another copy in another browser that it is actually running using WebDriver to control it. So it does work in certain areas so far. I think I just did that, all the whys and wherefores that came through from that, so I'm ahead of myself already, or something. So what is it? I'm looking for a way so that all the data can have a central core, all the information and the code and the documentation. I dislike artifacts in that they tend to get, particularly for documentation, they get written, they become out of date, and the developers can't use it, and the support can't use it. They've got to go back to the code. And the code will tell you what's happening, but not why, so you've lost information. So this system is designed so that, a bit like a wiki, it's always alive. But because I want something that can be used by everyone from the customer and the customer's boss all the way down to support, it needs to have a little bit less geeky than a wiki. So, unfortunately, open source is now come of age, so it's all possible. So, here's a basic page. It works on sections. If you open up a section, and obviously it's too small a screen to do a lot with, it's a normal editor that anyone can get used to. You add links. Those links can be to more sections, more pages underneath, or code, and you'll see some of that soon. So, but to merge the needs is also designed to be in all those areas, make it simple to use. Because that's a normal editor, the idea is not to hide from people the tools that they want. So you will have the project manager will put links into his Microsoft project files, word processing files, whatever the BAs like to use. But if they're all hooked in, at least then we can pull the data down when we need it. I'm finding this hard with my eyes. I can't see you, or I can't see what I'm trying to read. So bear with me. So to make that work, it's a Java app, which is why I'm on the Java stream. In actual fact, it's all entirely written in Groovy. The basic core are classes that could be in either. A lot of the drivers above that are using Groovy scripts and DSLs. The idea being the scripts for those of us who like to develop, and the DSLs so that we can give things to other teams like support, test, project managers to get what they want. It runs up at the moment on a single machine, but it's browser-based, so anyone can get to it who's available from it. And in fact, at the start and the end, you'll see that the actual website, usdlc.net, is actually a copy of this running on a web server. If you do go to it, you'll find the loading very slow at the moment. I haven't optimized my connections. In the JavaScript world, they've argued about lots of small files because they can run in parallel. But the truth is the most latency is in the connections. So I need to have a couple of large files. So that's just saying it runs up as a Java app, but that's not really material. What it is, it's a single jar file to download, and it unpacks itself in a directory and does all its work. So it's very useful to run inside a project, inside the source control, so that your code and your documentation are all together. So the aim, and it's very broad rather than deep, is to cover all the different people in the software development lifecycle. So you should be able to run it up. This one there, you can unpack it, immediately create a new project, and the representatives from the customer can start putting in information. They can use that to communicate with the business analysts, or whatever other terms you want to use. Sometimes they're all the same person in a small project. That's nice. You don't need this if one person is doing it all, but in practice we don't have that. Particularly in the open source arena. Yes, we don't have project managers, but we do, because they're the leaders of the open source project. The customer is them themselves, but it's still a large group who are from multiple areas. So to cover all these, part of it's text, part of it is task management, and part of it is integrating the text with the code, or what you call the test code, or even the production code. And I'll show you that in a minute. So all I've done there is separated all the groups and talked about how it would affect them. Sorry, that's one thing is compared to two. There's no need to go to them in detail, but we all know the type of people who are involved and the communication problems that we have. Architects create wonderful documents that never get read. Sit on a shelf and gather dust. Yes, inside this that can too, but the way this works is that almost every paragraph you activate. You actually connect it to the code, so that if someone changes something, it becomes clear. Sometimes the common jobs, like a team lead, can be anything from someone who decides who does what task to the actual vision holder for the technical side of a project. I separate a software designer from developer because I've spent a long time trying to decide what I am, and I'm a designer, not just a developer. But often it's the same person in most projects we are. Testers. Technical writer is an interesting one. Even open source projects need a technical writer, someone to actually turn what is a nice and interesting tool into something people can read. If you look at my site or look at this project as it goes along, you'll see that I don't have a technical writer, which doesn't matter, it works. But when someone doesn't understand something, you change it then. And a technical writer is the person who then takes all those pieces and creates the document, the book, the manual, the help files, whatever you need for your customers or the people who are using the software to be able to use it effectively. In open source, it's one of our biggest problems, is that we can see some really good software and then spend a long time trying to work out how to make it work. The benefit here is that by integrating small amounts of text with your code, the technical writer doesn't have to go and become a discoverer as well. He can actually create it. He has enough information in front of him to create the full and end product. Okay, that's all of that. And so we talked about open source projects a minute ago. I have talked to people who run projects who can see a benefit to be able to hook all this together. At the moment, on an open source project, the developers who are active have to decide based on bug lists what to do, which is not everything, because that doesn't tell them what the priorities are among the core team, so therefore they do that through another means. And then the prioritization really comes down to what you're interested in doing. So just to give you an example, and as I said, as a software designer, of how this can be done and how you can mix them without boring developers with too much text. Here's an example of a requirement to create a small DSL to read CSV files. It's part of a larger part of my application for reading or for migrating data. So you read the CSVs and you update the database as part of a project update. So we all start with a brief. If it's in a small team, it's often just the team leader telling you what needs to be done. But if it's not written down and you don't understand it, you need to go back and forwards. All I'm doing here is putting it into a fixed form. It works well for distributed teams because then you do have to write it down. So the brief is to start with. Then we start seeing the change. This is where the person who's thinking in terms of testing becomes involved. They need to say, well, let's just define from the brief what needs to be written. Paul talked to this morning, Paul King, about making your code look readable to the client. That's not always perfect because you have to make your code more brittle. Sometimes it's better to just have them connected. And in this case, this is what I'm doing. You could do either or both. So we started out with a brief up here that said we need to read CSV files. This is an extremely simple one. The one on the system has the more complex requirements around the size of the file and the different types of headers. So if I want to say how am I going to do that, okay, I want to collect a data source, as you see it's highlighted there, from a CSV file, and then there's a sample CSV below. If I were to try and run that, it runs in browser, so in the system now. It's not actually in the browser, it's on the server, which happens to be the same machine. The red line means it failed. And if I actually look down here, all technical guff, because the file's internally, but it says it can't find anything because there's nothing below that. But that can be written and done before anyone starts coding. It's a form of definition that stays alive. And if I come along later on and change my brief, or kick my camera over, then the system will flag that as a task that you've changed the brief, but you actually haven't changed anything below it that was probably describing how the brief works. So there is a level that we're not going into today, connecting these things together so you don't lose track. Because if anyone's written lists of tasks, we know how quickly they go out of date. Okay. No backing code, it fails. So in this case, if I'm doing what they call a spike, it's all going to be sitting on the same page. In practice, I'll show you one in a minute where it's actually in the production system and only the test code is in the page. But it's all in front of you so that it's visible. It has a system whereby you may not show the lower technical parts to people who aren't interested, so you can hide them. But in most cases, they like it there because they like to see the results there. We have people who still use line counts as their productivity, scary as that may seem. So up here we said all we want to do was, the first line was the only thing. We're just going to read a CSV file, and that's effectively part of a DSL or an extended one later on. They'll say, I'll read the CSV and I want to do this with it or that with the data. So this is where the concept of DSLs become involved. You want to give the people at that level only the basic information. They don't want to have to see the scaffolding, but it needs to be there. So with separation of concern, we have for the person who may be, say in this case, data migration is probably someone who handles the data. We may have a couple of simple instructions like read the CSV, read a SQL file, combine the data, etc. They'll have simple commands. Below that, we have a DSL scaffolding here. There you'll see the command CSV in there, and all it's really doing is actually calling a class in this case. The reason that's more complicated than it needs to be is you might want to use that to extend and have different, CSV doing different things based on the type of information. Language here is Groovy, which is why you've got this sort of format. It doesn't matter. It can work in a number of others. The quick demonstration I'll show you afterwards, which is the one that does this, is actually in CoffeeScript. So, and then from that, because of the magic of quick writing, there's the class that does the work. It's using the open source CSV reader, OpenCSV, to read it, puts it into a Groovy format so we can actually see what we're doing. If you need to ask questions, you can interrupt me at any time. I know that it's all sort of newish in approach. Yep.
You mentioned that this is a language agnostic.
Yep, that's in the... I didn't have the opportunity to do the demonstrations I had before. The two I'll show you today are Groovy, because it's a core DSL language, and the one afterwards is CoffeeScript, which is actually sitting on top of JavaScript in Rhino.
So can I use this for Erlang?
You can. I haven't yet. So far, I've only set it up for JVM languages. The intention is to be able to do any language that I can get access to from the command line.
Is this also a version control?
Not yet. It will be. The intention, or the process now, is that the actual application, including everything you see here, sits inside your project in version control. In practice, it's designed to, in the long run, do the version control, a lot of the version control for you, for everything but your core code. So when you, it's going off slightly off subject, but suppose you go out here and you put this line in here. That will automatically generate a task. The first person to open that task gets a branch in version control, right? They can pass that task on, everything else, but it'll stay in the branch until the task is marked as finished. And then it gets merged back into wherever you've decided that should be merged. And the aim eventually will be to tie that into the source code as well, so you can actually keep your source nicely separate. I dislike when I'm working that I can't check in because I haven't finished. And I don't really want to take a branch because it's too hard to work. So the aim here is for the software to do that for us. I understand version control and branches to a small extent, not as well as a lot of people, but I do know that my PM doesn't. And the truth is I don't really want to know that much as well if I can help it. I want just to do it. So yeah, that is the aim there. I intend to do Haskell in the next few weeks, which is a non-JVM language. It's easy enough to do for anything that compiles in the command line, including C#. So because the core is Groovy, I can actually call C# classes on a Windows box and on this directly. So the aim is to make it totally language agnostic, but November came far too quickly. No problems. So the implementation, this one is Groovy, but it could, in a Java project, I would actually make that extremely Java-like because Groovy and Java are the same. It might still be compiled as Groovy for dynamic running, but it can actually then be put straight back into your project directly. In practice, it already does Java because it was an easy one to do quick compiles on because it has an integrated compiler. The only other bit of magic here is with DSLs, we all talk about them, but internal DSLs need some way to tie it all together. Because this is inside this application, I'm just using it effectively on my binding, which is the data core below any dynamic language that's running on the JVM. The JSR 223, is it, or 5, provides a binding. It's effectively just a directory of data that any script that runs knows about. Unfortunately, they're not all the same. Certainly the one for Rhino is a totally different binding to the one that I'd use in Groovy. But either way, they're just name value pairs. This include allows you to include other files, as you can see here, and they'll go directly into the binding to be used. So if we go scroll off for a second, that's just a class file. Because I'm doing testing here, I've had to turn it into a script, hence that silly-looking string at the bottom. The reason being that I can then include that, and then any program will have the class file ready to load. More closely tied is the DSL Groovy script there, which actually does any DSL definitions. In a minute I'll show you one in CoffeeScript, so it's not related to any language. Now we see you get a green line. So it's as simple as that. We're done. We've actually tested okay, it's not a very complex app, but the problem is that all the complex ones I can't sit here and show you in this short time period. But to show you that it's dynamic, if I switch that and attempt to run it again, as you can see it goes red, and we get a classic failure message. One of the nice things about Groovy is its assert information is quite descriptive of what's going to happen. In this case, it's telling me you're expecting 3 and you got, or expecting 2 and you got 3. Expecting 3 and got 2, sorry. So in this system, when you have it running, if that is running locally, then you just get flagged as we saw here. If you're running it from an integration server, then it's going to generate tasks. In fact, either way, it generates tasks. So that if you've got something that's been running for 6 months and it stops running, a task gets generated. Whoever is reviewing those tasks then decides if it's important, whether the codes or the tests need to replace the usual process. But again, it's so they don't get lost. Okay, I said I was going to show you a slightly more complicated one, and probably slightly is not is an understatement. As you can see here, I'm actually using the code, but I'm not typing anything in. It's running itself. I have it's the same server, 2 browsers. This one happens to be Chrome. The main one is running on Safari. The reason is just being a Mac, it was easier to run the original Safari, and because I use WebDriver for the driving, Chrome is one of the ones that works best on the Mac at the moment, just due to core Java library issues. But this particular example is a DSL for doing screencasts. So we start out by associating the name screencast with Coffee, which is CoffeeScript run on the server. So therefore I can go blah.screencast and it'll actually create that file. It knows to compile as CoffeeScript and to load that DSL scaffolding I talked about automatically. Whereas before you saw I didn't include because I was doing a spike. Now I don't need to. I've said screencast, it knows to do that. This is my design page for doing this application. This is live and running, hence all the green. If I ran it now, it probably wouldn't be, but that's because I'm not on integration server here. So all I did here was I defined what do I need to do a screencast. I need to put notes on the screen, which is the one you see at the bottom here. So therefore I've said I want a note, And this is the information on the note. It's not well documented. This is a developable document, nice and light. I would expect someone who, if you had more people involved, you want clearer documentation. But literally this is a note with the header field and the content of the note. And then, because this is actually using 2 DSLs, it's using one for testing as well. So it actually has WebDriver under there. So it's checking the element. This one is a very primitive WebDriver, no fancy units over the top. And it's just checking certain elements to see if they exist, to make sure that when I said I got a note, it actually came up there. And it's doing that, as you can see here, by looking for the title, which would have been screen definition, and what it's running against. WebDriver is quite neat in that you run it against a real web browser when you're testing, or in my case when you're running it, or you can use it against something like HTML unit for continuous integration, and you'll still get pass or fails, hopefully. In this case, it's using jQuery. HTML unit tends to work with jQuery, but sometimes they get out of sync. So obviously I want to create a screencast. We saw one there because a lot of the screencasts are actually live, as you saw with that CSV demonstration. So you actually want to create the pages on the fly, which is why you'll see them here. It's got this temp, blah, blah, blah. That's a temporary page. So that when I run it, it won't clash with another copy. So I can run it 5 times. I get 5 temporary copies. The cleanup mechanism deletes them out of the directory afterwards. So we talked about notes, little things like setting out what keys to use. You saw I was pressing escape then to get out. This one's set up with F1 or the back tick. Then the next thing I needed to test was prompts. The notes are just come up the screen and things keep going. So you can actually do it as an automated display. Flash the screen up, wait 20 seconds, put a note up, etc. In most cases, like here, I've got a keyboard driven and I want a prompt. And you'll see below it's just code. It's very simple. Sets the timeout so the prompt only waits a certain amount of time. You can say the prompt can only wait a minute. So I don't do that here because I don't want it to move on when I'm talking. So these are all the tests that I wrote before this period now to create my DSL. So these tests are, it looks similar, but that's actually in CoffeeScript. And if anyone's experienced at all of CoffeeScript, it makes JavaScript usable if you don't mind indentation as your block definition. It's one of the downsides because it's hard. I don't mind indentation, but it's hard to explain that to a project manager or someone. There will be other ways. So here we are. This is appending a section being this yellow piece here. The pages that are always broken up into sections so they can be clear. Each section is unique. So when you create a task, it'll actually reference a section, and it'll reference a section for the life of the project. So therefore, you can go back to tasks that need to be reviewed and then review what had been done on them before. This just allows you to append and insert sections, and then it's checking to make sure they work. So it's got the tests in place here. So it's checking this section at the end of the page, etc. I don't need to go into too much detail, but you can see them all there. Those are all tests. So therefore, I've gone along. What happened was I started off and I wrote all the English parts of the paragraph saying I want to do this, this, and this. I then inserted all examples, like how to append a section, how to insert code, because that's code. What I'm saying is that is text and this is code. It's got a code editor. It has auto-completion, not available yet, but that's part of the open source system, CodeMirror. And below that, I actually have the source code that ran from this. I will develop that source code in an IDE, because IDEs are easier to use, but they're here for reference, and quick changes can be made here when need to be. So here's one in CoffeeScript. This is that DSL definition file. That your people who use the DSL don't need to see, but it needs to be there to do things like prompt. There's the prompt call we talked about. It has title, it has content. It records where you are, then puts up the note, and then waits for a server response. In other words, me pressing escape. The snap and recover, quite literally, so that I can actually go off to another page, show you something, and if I press continue, it'll go back to where it started. As I haven't tested it since I've done this last piece of work, I don't really want to now. So they're all classic type of thing there. That is what I would call scaffolding. It's all the stuff that you need to do so that people can clearly say what they want to say. So I will say something like insert section. So insert then does the targeted insert of whatever that is there. And if I go down to section has an insert command. That's all just code, but it does it's all invisible once it's been written. Then below that, we have here the, in this case, again, Groovy code that supports that for the server side. There's also one for the client side, in this case, because it's running this sort of work. I'm not trying to go through the details. There's too much of it there. As you see, it's a little larger, but it's still supportable. And I can still edit it from there. I can't move on while I'm inside the code editor. Right. I don't know how, going for time, about half an hour in, aren't I? So I'm going to be too quick again, which is lack of practice. I've listed, it was an interesting exercise last night, listing most of the open source projects I use to develop this, because it wouldn't be possible without our current state of technology where we have all these great tools. And I've even ignored the next level down. If you load Groovy, it brings in JUnit, which is a unit testing framework. It brings in Ant, which allows me to do quite powerful file manipulation without having to go to XML. But these are the ones directly that I used to date. So CK Editor, which used to be FCK Editor, I'm not sure why they changed the name, is the WYSIWYG editor we saw here. It generates that, including this guy. I just went in here, and bit of a small screen. Have to be careful because that can cause issues. So it's a normal editor, so I can now go into there, and I can actually change the length. So just like a word processor, it can be used by anyone who's comfortable with modern WYSIWYG processors, or if you prefer to go back to HTML, it's there too. There are heavier ones. I think we saw some of the demonstration of ACE the other day, but it's a lot larger. It does the same thing. It's all in JavaScript. CodeMirror is the code editor we saw there. It has the benefit of I can plug in and put in things like auto-completion, the different syntax highlighting, and eventually a lot more features that will make DSLs more usable. One of the biggest problems with DSLs is that you are inventing a new language. And yes, it's domain specific, so hopefully if you're doing it for engineers, they'll understand the words, but someone has to explain to them how they all fit together to do what they want to do. And they do sometimes tend to be a little bit fragile in that we had the discussion this morning about being able to change the words around in Latin. We don't tend to do that with DSLs, so sometimes they've got to remember, they've got to put A before B, which may not be how they talk, but it was how you understood their domain. So the eventual aim is that with CodeMirror, I can actually keep patterns in there and tell you how it's going. For CoffeeScript, for example, I can actually compile the file as it's being typed, and so you can see the results, and they can see when they're getting errors, just like you would from an IDE. CoffeeScript's quite neat. It's a compiler that compiles to JavaScript. JavaScript has got lots of facilities and a very old-fashioned syntax. CoffeeScript improves on a lot of those, provides good facilities, but as I say, its Python style of indentation of lines concerns me, because for a DSL, that's something you've got to try and teach the users of the DSL if they're going to do anything that requires blocks of code. I haven't yet decided how to do that. Jeb is a Groovy browser automation tool, which was talked about this morning. When I wanted to learn Jeb, I used this tool here to do it. I took the book of Jeb and I put it into this system, and I automated every single paragraph. Because when they said, it does this, I'd create the code and found out whether it did or not and how to make it work. So it's actually in here, and I can show you that. Groovy, as we've talked about earlier, is the core language. It's also the core one for doing technical DSLs. It's very good for unit testing running and any tests, in fact. I tend to use Groovy for all the DSLs for the developer level, and possibly CoffeeScript for some of the higher ones, because it actually gives us slightly less. You don't need to know about braces and certain other techniques, but you can do either, and I do both. I couldn't find a link for JavaScript. Does anyone actually know the definitive source of JavaScript information? There's so many out there, and you can argue them, but it's hard to say. Yeah, I thought of that. ECMAScript is very documented, but is that the definitive source? It is officially. It does. That's right. So you go. That's why I'm saying I didn't put a definitive source in here because I'm using Rhino for the server. But as soon as you hit the browser, then you're using whatever you're using V8 or ABC. So I didn't put a link in. Got tired. H2 is a very neat little open source SQL database. I found it by accident when I needed a database for the task management. I was going to go NoSQL. And I came across a site that said, ours is pretty good, but H2 is faster. And I'm going, well, in that case, I can query the database. So while I'm not necessarily an SQL lover, it ended up being the best solution for me at that point. HTML unit's been around for a long time. There is test pages in here for testing directly. I tend to use it under WebDriver or a WebDriver derivative, which is the Selenium approach mostly now. Ivy is one of the approaches for dependency management. So you can actually pull out these ones directly from, it tells you on the web how to get the latest jar file or the latest data file. I've actually have a page for that inside the application here where I actually define them all. It goes and gets the jar file for the project, running code, the source, and the Java doc. So the source is there, and next time I use the IDE and it can't find a source, I can just say, go and get it. It's already sitting in the directory. Quite useful for that part. My dependency management includes straight downloads, because sometimes people don't have things in the management system. And the eventual idea is to integrate with Git so that you actually, if you want to be involved in the source code of an open source project, it can be involved as part of this. And you can actually then make your changes and push them back to the server and see if they want to use them. jQuery, who doesn't use jQuery? If you've got to use front end, that is. It certainly is a very ubiquitous tool. It made me understand functional programming, even though it swears it isn't. OpenCSV you saw a minute ago. Rhino is an obvious one. They're telling you they're going to make it faster. But it's certainly, because it runs on the JVM, it works well with this application. Selenium, as I say, split personality. There's Selenium 1 and there's WebDriver, which is 2. They tie the two together. Different parts of testing. I've done some work in Scala for the fun of it, so there is already a Scala language that you can run directly inside of this, as well as the ones we saw there. And the YUI compressor, which is why I originally put Rhino in, so I could actually compress on the server side, but it's useful anyway for, excuse me, compressing CoffeeScript once it's compiled. I ran just slightly early, but not too bad all in all. I'm not sure whether that was clear or not. Maybe I can tell more from the questions. So, if anyone's got any thoughts? Yes?
I love the idea, but have you put this into practice at all?
Only internal projects at this point. This is very early days, right? Okay. So, no, I haven't put it into a live project yet.
Okay. One thing I'm always hesitant about is this whole IDE thing, it's just layers and top layers, and so much time to create this and things like that. Do you think this can be reduced to a level of simplicity that's just bang?
Okay, it's interesting that what I make as an assumption doesn't come across because I didn't say it. The idea is simplicity. Simplicity takes longer to do, but it's when you've got something that's being used across the board, it does provide benefits. So, for example, I said this is a single jar file. You literally download a single jar file. If you had no internet, you drop it in a directory, run it, it comes up. You put that directory under your project, and you've got access to everything you need without changing anything else. The eventual idea is to actually have that running out of Git, so that it still becomes... sorry, one more thing. With that jar file... Sorry, I'm jumping back and forth slightly. It's in installation. Obviously, I know where everything is, which helps. We were there before. Okay, there's that jar file we're talking about. That's the one you can download from the site, but you can also make changes to it. Then you want to give it to someone. So you just run this script. It'll create a new jar file, which includes all your changes. So even now, you can hand it across to different machines quickly with everything you've got in it. And that can include the project source code if you run the tree that way. The next intention there is to have it Git-based. It'll fork, and you can actually define a server and then go to another machine in the same building and say, right, I want a copy of this, and given a very small file, it will then take a copy of some other machine's image as it stands now, including their source code and everything to go. So you'll have, if you're going to take it from my GitHub server, it'll be read-only, but inside the building it's not, it's connected. That's what Git does well. Many years ago I wanted to work on the concept of disconnection tolerance, and Git gives me that. I can take this work, go home on my notebook, come back a week later, plug it in, it'll all just sink in. And if there are any merge errors, they will come up as tasks for whoever does those tasks to do. And so my intention is to make it extremely simple. But yeah, I've got a winner if I can work out how to communicate that I have done that. There's not enough time for everything. That is the intention. The reason for the software development lifecycle is that it's what's needed up and down the line. You know, support people need that too. They need to be able to take a snapshot and go away and come back and put it in. But also something that the more technical people, like architects, can come back and see that, yes, it does meet what they're asking for. Or when someone asks them about a project, they can actually go back to this and say, yes, I can see where it belongs in the system. The reason for the task management portion, which is... yeah, that's what I am here. That's what I'm doing here too. It's the aim is that there is none. You should be able to run Git as is, but someone's going to know about merging. That person will get a task on their board that says there was a merging error when the project manager tried to put this in here. So yeah, the idea is to reduce that as much as possible. So the next step in that evolution is to be able to run from this and to have it manage your repository, your project repository files. And say, yes, I want to check in now. Yes, I want it to be a branch.
One last comment I noticed on the UI. If you click on that green button over the snapshot, and then it went green or red. If I just looked at that, I didn't even realize I was looking. I was like, well, how did you run that? So I don't know, maybe it might be
yes,
more intuitive just to have a run button.
It will have. I've been told that by my son is doing a master's in UI, and he says you've got to have this. Yeah, I know, I haven't had time yet. So at the moment, okay, I've got a drop down, and one of the ones happens to be run.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and when I was doing something with links yesterday, I said I'll just make the link clickable because it's just easier to do in a demo. So it's actually not it literally is brand new because I hadn't done it before. Yeah, because originally it used to reference the data. The other thing that's not obvious is if I go in here and change something, then click out, it's doing an automatic save. And that save will actually save it into the branch that you're working on for the task that you're working in.
Is there like an overview page where we can get a list of all the... I would imagine it's broken up into a tree structure and you just basically see...
Yeah. Yeah. It's been written by a developer, so the overview page could do with some polishing. Small screen will do two things at a time, or one thing at a time. First of all, the main page. Yes, we started off with general information. Then we get into the bit about saying, hey, this is live stuff. So, for example, I will document things that aren't finished. Eventually, they're red marked, they're red lines saying, this is, you wanted to do it, but it hasn't been done yet. Then I've got a whole heap of information down here, which is thick overview. So, you can read it, but... Yep. It's not actually in this release. This is released on the internet at the moment. It's part of the intention process. First of all, in your navigation, there's also standard tree type navigation. And if I can scroll this up and down, I'm already there. The two things you're talking about there is one is inside tasks, where, as I said, anything you do will cause a task to get generated. So someone has to go through their tasks. Most of them close them straight away. So if I actually edit a single section, right, and it's got if there are any sections with any code attached to them, they will become a task. Because why hasn't someone instrumented this yet? Okay, if a section does have instrumentation and you change the section, if you didn't change the code, it's going to create a task saying why was one changed, not the other. So yes, it's all there. In terms of your question. As you create users, they get home pages. Okay. At the moment, my home page is relatively empty, but the idea is there'll be a list of tasks there that references your group, your person, whoever you are. So as a developer, you change a few things. They'll say you haven't actually done a test on that yet, so you made a change to that testing it. Why? Yeah. It's a nag point.
Yes.
Yes, it's in my notes here. It's one of the things I didn't mention, because I was using a quote from his book, which I don't remember what it was now. I wouldn't be able to find it, but it was just interesting because I was thinking along those lines. Yes, there is a lot of that involved here. The tasks, you pass them on. So the idea is that, particularly an open source project, but really it should be in any project. I'm a developer. Someone's given me a task to do. I don't understand it. If you take it, that was what it was like. Under getting things done, if it's under 2 minutes, I should go up and ask them. Okay, but the truth is, a lot of them, they're too busy. You've got to get a meeting, all that. And maybe it's not your task. So you pass the task back to your team lead to say, I need more information. Yeah, it might go all the way back up to the business. Yeah, anyone can stop it on the way down. But it's all recorded in Git as being part of the history of that file. So therefore, you'll know that the team lead made a decision. Okay, so if the customer gets upset with the decision, at least they know who to blame. Okay, maybe that won't be so popular after all.
Oh, I'm not sure. But also that menu looks a bit intimidating. Is it possible to simplify that?
This one, okay, that's not. Yeah, that's not a menu. Okay. Yeah, that's not a menu. That is a project, and this happens to be a rather large project because that's this project. Okay. Yes. So that's a book called on Unifying the software design or whatever development lifecycle. That book, the only reason it'll stay in there is it's the definitive reference. You want to know how to do something, and you can search that book. There'll be searches as well, of course. What'll happen is here, if you've got a project called John, that project goes in there. Okay, and that's the only one you'll have open. And in truth, you'll eventually only have your home page open. It'll say, oh, this is the ones I want to look at. I only want to look at the development level, core code bits. I don't care about the project management. But the truth is, sooner or later you want to go back up to see why someone decided you wanted to do that, whatever that is. So, and the reason it's all tied together is that the BA will have put together a section that says they expect a CSV file to do A, B, C. And then someone has come along and instrumented that and said, here's what we need to do to test that. And hopefully, it might be the developer does that, but it could be anywhere down the line. And someone will get it and they should be able to see everything they need to do the job. If there is enough information documented, it must be passed up or put into the document. Otherwise, how can you expect your document writer later on to be able to make a definitive decision on what is involved, if your project's that large? I've enjoyed myself in the last year. Thanks to Paul King, who got me involved in Groovy, who's gave me somewhere to go with it. But it's, as I say, it is language agnostic, so I like doing lots of languages. So there's quite a bit of variety in there.
I'm sure you can reduce a lot of those communication errors between designs and
yeah, and that is the core aim.
Yeah, that's right. We know this is a mythical name.
Very mythical. It's also, because it integrates the testing, you can tell the continuous integration server to run all those tests and it'll come back with what's there. Yeah. But also, the project manager sees them, so he'll see that, you had this many tasks 2 weeks ago and now you've got twice as many tasks. You've finished 20 but not 30 to go.
Okay, dumb question, I might have missed it. How do I take content out into someone else's favourite task management, project management?
You didn't miss it. I mean, there's not how much I can do in a situation like this. It effectively at this stage, because you have a normal editor, it's you put in links directly to your so it can run links directly off your file system.
But you're generating tasks for
the tasks are done internally because they need to be. My intention eventually is to be able to export that because people will still want to use Jira or whatever. Yeah, that's right. And there are standards for communications, and most of these things have open interfaces now. The intention will be, yes, so that you can actually run that into whatever system you need. Because it's not just that. Different people use different task manager. Jira works well for developers, doesn't work so well for the BA team. You'd much rather be using Excel anyway, but that's right. So you've got to allow the exports. But it's an open source project. Hopefully I'll get some help when we get to that level. Any more? That's not too bad on time then. It's only 5 minutes early. Yeah. So you get a chance for a cup of tea before the next one.
I like how everything wrapped up in a
Yeah, the aim, of course, was to make it a normal editable wiki rather than one that requires you to know all those fancy. I mean, I use a wiki, they're fine, but then I try and teach someone like the business, they go, what's that rubbish, you know? I don't. Yeah. So you will have, I mean, the BAs will put links into Word documents and to Excel spreadsheets. But the testing, for example, I can read the Excel spreadsheets directly. There's Java libraries, so I can use them for my testing as they came in. Not my intention at this stage is totally open source. It would be nice to be able to. Yeah, it would be nice to be able to find a way to finance that. At the moment, it's being financed by my working elsewhere, which limits how much I can do. So no, I have no intention of setting up a company at this stage, but because I don't want to be able to do both sides.
No, I think it might be a good idea to try something like that, at least getting into working environment so that's what gets more refined and from there it can grow.
Yep. Bootstrapping is always the challenge.
Yeah.
Thank you.